All right. So we are back with part two of our bracing series. In part one, we talked about the mechanics of a brace and the anatomy involved and how we're really building a brace as a canister and thinking about the lid, the base, and the sides of that canister. So if you missed it, head back to part one. But today we're going to be talking about bracing with a belt. We're going to go through why we wear a belt, the types of belt that we will wear, fitting and sizing of these belts, as well as where we should be putting that on our body. And last, we're going to wrap up with how to build the brace with keeping in mind that we're going to have a belt involved this time. I am Rachel Verrill.
And I am Amber Verrill. And we are the co-owners of Ambitious Strength and Performance. And yeah, so let's get started. Why wear a belt? We wear a belt because it helps to increase our intra-abdominal pressure, IAP. And if you haven't heard about IAP, I'm going to explain it to you. So as Rachel explained earlier or in the last episode about our abdominal or our core being a canister, we like to picture this as the top of the can is our thoracic diaphragm. The bottom of the can is our pelvic diaphragm. And the piece of aluminum that wraps all the way around the outside is your TA or your abdominal wall and all of your other abdominal muscles. Intra-abdominal pressure comes from the pressure that is being built up inside of your abdomen between the space in your abdomen and the wall. And the belt helps to increase that because it gives us a feedback mechanism in order to push and drive more force or more pressure into that canister so that it becomes more stable and allows us to move more weight. I think that was a good explanation of IAP.
I think so. Yeah, the only other thing that I think about with intra-abdominal pressure is we can build as much as we want in our abdomen, but that's going to continue to expand our abdomen out. When we have a belt, we have something to expand into that gives us that feedback back, but we're really pressing into the belt to allow the belt to press back on our body to increase that pressure. We're going to talk about fitting, but I see a lot of power lifters where their belt is so tight before they start, and you're not building a brace into the belt at that point. So we're going to talk about how to fix that here in a minute.
Yeah, and then vice versa. If it's too loose, you can't create the brace. So yeah, fitting is proper. Fitting properly is important. Let's talk about the types of belts.
Yes.
And you can cover that.
Yeah, there's a lot of different types of belts out there on the market. You're typically either going to have a cloth belt or a leather belt. The cloth belts tend to be a Velcro belt. And these are things that we're seeing more in Olympic lifters or CrossFitters because the buckle that's necessary for a leather belt can get in the way of some of those athletes. And also the cloth and Velcro belt allows for a little bit more flexion, extension, rotation through the core that you're not typically seeing in a powerlifting sport. For our leather belts, there are typically 3 different classes of leather belts. We have buckle belts, lever belts, and then ratchet belts. And these are really just talking about the enclosure that keeps that belt together. So a buckle belt is going to be like on your belt buckle, and it's going to be a prong that then slides into a hole. So it can be a single prong, a double prong, and I have seen one triple prong, but that is on a very large human being. Lever belts are what we're seeing a lot of when folks finish their lift and they flick the belt, and it's part of the whole theme of their lift, really. And so that lever belt is going to be at a fixed distance on the belt, and you're putting 1 prong or 2 prongs into a hole, and then you're using the lever to really clamp down and tighten that belt. So on a lever belt, you're at a fixed distance, whereas with the buckle belt, you really can change the distance or the tension on that belt depending on what you are using the belt for that day. And then the last kind, which is my favorite, is the ratchet belt. And these ratchet belts essentially have what looks like the enclosure for a ski boot on the front of the belt. And so this really allows you to tension down the belt, increase or decrease that tension with just a little bit of a flick of a ratchet there, which personally for me, I find it very helpful. We talked in the last session about how we don't always need to have 100% bracing in all of our lifts, and how sometimes when we're building our warm-ups, we're bracing at 60% because we're lifting at 50%. So I like the ratchet belt because it gives me the flexibility to tighten and loosen in very small increments as I'm increasing my weight to give me more and more feedback for some of that intra-abdominal pressure. And so those are really the four main types of belts that we're seeing right now. There are a few belts now. I don't know what the buckle is called, where it will have two upright pieces. It's essentially a lever belt that has multiple sizes. So the lever belt is typically a single size. Again, if you want to change the width on a lever belt, you have to take the whole enclosure mechanism off. But there is another belt buckle right now that allows you to change the distance and still have the functionality of that lever itself.
Pioneer and SBD. Both
Yeah,
make one.
Pioneer and SBD are both making them. I'm sorry, I don't know the name.
Yes, that's okay. I'll take that job. Perfect. That was a very, very thorough description of all the types of belts. Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add there.
Oh, great.
So let's move on to fitting and sizing.
Super important.
Super important. Rachel and I both went to a conference 2 years back and listened to a presenter talk about how belt sizing affects urinary incontinence on the platform in women who are lifting and end up peeing when they deadlift or squat or, you know, whatever movement it is. And she brought up a good point about the width of belts and how that can have an effect, especially on women where, you know, powerlifting originated as a sport for men. And along with that came obviously all the equipment that was created for it, which has also probably been built biasly towards men. So a 4-inch belt on a 5'3" woman isn't always a great thing. Obviously, there could be a 5'3" woman out there who has a long torso, and that belt might fit them. But we want to think a little bit more about torso height in comparison to the width, because you don't necessarily want to be taking up the entire height of that space with a belt. That's what's going to cause some spillage over. And if you end up like crossing above or like below and end up crushing at the height of the diaphragms themselves, you're going to change the pressure patterns, and that's going to have a huge effect on your bladder, which sits, is it underneath your pelvic floor?
It's on top of your pelvic floor. Your pelvic floor is holding it in your body.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, that obviously has a giant effect on your bladder, which is sitting between your two diaphragms itself. So I'm 5'3" and my torso is pretty short. And when I wear a 4-inch belt, it ends up like coming up over my floating ribs and giving me some pain. And I'm sure if I had continued to lift with a 4-inch belt, it might cause some sort of pressure problems. But I've been pretty comfortably lifting with a 3-inch belt for 2.5, 3 years now. But yeah, fit and sizing is superbly important. So if you are a shorter person who likes to lift with a belt, think about, you know, the distance from your rib cage to your pelvis. And I just feel for that hip bone right on the side of my waist, feel for the top of that hip bone, and then I feel for that final rib. And I want to make sure that there's a little bit of space between those when I put my belt on. That's usually a pretty good indicator of height. Now, in terms of tightness, right? Rachel mentioned this a little bit earlier. We don't want it too tight because then we can't create and build pressure and kind of expand inside into that belt to create force against the belt, which is then going to create an equal force back against our bodies, which is what that intra-abdominal pressure is. We want to make sure that good rule of thumb, I was just talking to a client about this yesterday, is to be able to just fit like a finger or two in between your abdomen and your belt. You know, 2 fingers might be a bit wide, but I know that there are people who prefer to deadlift or squat with a little bit of a looser belt, just so they can kind of manage at the bottom of a deadlift and the bottom of a squat. We're all kind of balled up. So it can get a little bit uncomfortable with your belt pressing against your legs. So sometimes people will wear it a bit looser from one or the other. But you want to, for the most part, be able to feel the pressure that you're bracing into when you're wearing that belt. And if you feel like you're trying to reach your belly out and push your gut out to try to meet it, it's probably a little bit too loose. 1 or 2 notches tighter would be a great fit, so that you could then expand into that a little bit more and create a bit more pressure.
And vice versa. If you put the belt on and you don't feel like you can take that big belly breath because you're taking that big belly breath and it's giving you GERD or it makes you feel like you're going to vomit, which has happened to me, that means that the belt is too tight, because you should have enough space to be able to press out into that belt. So one thing I do when I put my belt on is make sure that I can at least turn it a little bit left and right. That's just telling me it's at least loose enough that I'm able to actually spin the belt, but still apply the pressure with my belly.
Yeah, that's also another good rule of thumb. So if you don't want to be sticking your finger in between your belts, you can just see if you can move it side to side a little bit. But yeah, it's really trial and error. There's no, rule of thumb that you can really follow, and every belt is going to fit way differently. So it's really trial and error. And once you find the right belt, and you can roll with it.
Makes a big difference. And I'm 5'6". I'm only a couple inches taller than Amber, but my torso is much longer than hers. So I do well with the traditional 4-inch belt. So even something as we're only 2 or 3 inches apart in height, but my torso is so different, that really is going to take into account. So looking at that, like Amber said, that iliac crest to the bottom of the ribs, if you put your hands on your waist and you find the squishy part of your waist, when you push straight down, you'll feel that iliac crest. So you're trying to find a good sweet spot between the bottom of your ribs and the top of that pelvis there.
Yeah, I guess that brings us into positioning, because you're going to want to put the belt somewhere in the middle of that. Yeah. And the position will change from lift to lift. I wear my belt a bit higher for squats. I wear it a bit lower for deadlifts. That's just because when I get into the bottom, it tends to ride up into my ribs if I wear a little bit higher of a deadlift. I'm a conventional deadlifter, so I tend to get pretty curled up in the bottom of that movement. But yeah, position is going to be somewhere in the middle of that. Like I mentioned earlier, if the belt is too tall, it's going to end up compressing at the level of where either of your diaphragms attach, and that's going to create a change in the volume, a change in your anatomy, and that's going to change the way that you ultimately brace and potentially the outcome of that lift. So somewhere in the middle, like Rachel said, put your hands around your waist, come down, find the tops of your hips, come back up, find the tops of your ribs, and somewhere in between there is usually a really great place to start. But if you end up having it a little bit higher, you bend over and you're getting a little bit of gird, maybe try pushing it down a little bit and wearing it there. But yeah.
I do see a lot of people who push the belt really, really low onto their pelvis and then try to buckle it down. The pelvis is a really rigid and stable structure. You don't want your belt wrapping around your pelvis, because your pelvis has so much stability on its own. You want to be supporting the squishy part of your belly. And so making sure that that is sitting on the top of your pelvis or above it is going to be best. Really trying to avoid wrapping it around the pelvis a little bit there, just because the pelvis is so stable, it doesn't need that extra support. So you're losing out on the functionality of the belt when it's that low.
All right, let's talk about through how to build the brace together. I will let you talk about drawing the pelvic floor.
Yeah,
because you're the pro at that. And
that's my field.
But I'll get us set up. So we have the position of the belt set, and you have proper tightness. You can stuff 2 fingers in between your abs and the belt. You can twist it side to side a little bit, just enough so that it can move. And now we're going to talk about building the brace. I always think from the ground up, and you want to make sure that your torso is stacked. That means that your rib cage is stacked over your pelvis, right? We don't want our can tilted. We want our can standing nice and tall in its normal position. So that means rib cage stacked over our pelvis. I tend to think about squeezing my glutes as we're moving from the ground up so that I can secure my pelvis with my glutes, especially rooting my feet into the floor. And that will keep my pelvis from being either anteriorly tilted or too much posteriorly tilted. We don't want too much of either. We get that pelvis into a neutral position. Your ribs stack on top of it the same way. You don't want to be too flared with your chest too high, and you definitely don't want to be too tucked, rounding over like the Hunchback of Notre Dame. So now that you're stacked, everything is in alignment. I like to take a big, deep exhale, and I like to describe this as fogging the glass or the mirror in front of you. And what this does is this allows you to exhale without using all of your accessory musculature. I can exhale using my diaphragm directly, and that will allow me to help me to draw my TA in and also engage my obliques, which are the side abs. You have your six pack down the middle, your obliques are on either side of that six pack, connecting your rib cage to your pelvis. And so that nice big exhale allows me to get those muscles on and helps to secure that stack, or the stack that I've just made.
And then
the
pelvic floor.
Yeah.
So once you've exhaled all of that air, you start to engage that core like Amber talked about. And now we're trying to lift and engage the pelvic floor. And so for women, this is going to look like drawing your vagina up and inside your body. And for men, this is going to look like elevating the scrotum or drawing in the shaft of the penis. So for both, regardless of what your genitalia is, the focus is to squeeze and lift everything from the bottom. So once you've exhaled the air from your abdomen, you've engaged your core musculature, then you're going to draw up and in that pelvic floor to build that bottom of your canister.
Perfect. And now that we have our abs engaged, our transverse abdominis, that nice big sheath of muscle that wraps around our abdominals,
Yep.
And we have our obliques on, and now we have our pelvic diaphragm shortened.
Yep.
Correct. Now we get to shorten our thoracic diaphragm and take a nice deep breath in. And we think about just expanding 360 degrees, everything, all that air you're breathing in, all down and into and out of your belly into that belt. And that is essentially the 3 simple steps to a brace.
And that last piece is so important to keep everything on. The pelvic floor is up, your abs are on. And as you're breathing in, you're pressurizing that system. That's where you're building that intra-abdominal pressure. You're shortening that thoracic diaphragm by taking a breath in, which compresses everything in the abdomen and allows you to push out into that belt. So that's when you should really start to feel that pressure against the belts right at the end.
Yep. And something I learned from, I think it was Joe Sullivan talked about it originally, is just like continuing to increase that pressure. So I try to find that sensation and that brace with every movement I do. Not every movement I do, but every big 3 movement I do. And I try to build upon it. So my first breath isn't the fullest breath I can take. It's just creating that first 10, 20, 30% of pressure. And then as I continue my setup or continue through my squat, I tend to increase that. I take another breath in and that becomes 50, 60% of the brace that I'm building. If I'm stepping under 185 pounds to squat, that's probably plenty enough. When I start to get into my max attempts, 85, 90%, I'm making sure that I'm taking every breath that I take is very intentional in building that brace and that pressure.
And that's where some of these more flexible belts can be helpful too, is if you are doing a lift that is higher rep and potentially lower load and you need less intense of a brace, a ratchet or a buckle belt, or like one of the Pioneer lever belts will allow you to really fluctuate the amount of pressure that belt is giving back to your total system. And so in our next session, we're going to talk about exercises that you can do to help you learn the brace and exercises to help strengthen the musculature for that brace, because this really is a motor plan. For a lot of people, that pelvic floor piece is a new component of the brace. And for others, breathing in against an engaged core is also a very strange phenomenon to feel. So we're going to give some exercises and some primer things that you can do during or before your lifts to sort of get those muscles going and learn the motor plan for a proper brace.
Sweet. Can't wait to see you guys then.
Thank you.